Um, let's read this real quick. Game reveals are getting frustrating. Tired of teaser trailers that are more teaser than trailer. I'll elaborate on this. Tired of trailers that are more cinematic than gameplay. And let me be very clear here. I think developers are getting worse and worse and worse about telling us that trailers are gameplay, because it does show what you will see in a game, when most of what you see isn't actually what you'll be doing with controlling the actual gameplay. It's more like the lines are getting blurred between how often, when you're playing these more modern AAA-esque titles, that you are engaged in action scenarios where you're absolutely engaged in handling everything that's happening, and then it'll slide off into like a bit of a cinematic kind of scenario where you might have to do a button press or two, right? And so it's kind of really blurring the lines of what we should be considering gameplay and what we shouldn't be considering gameplay. Yeah. And I've seen it been happening a lot with, like, take for instance the new Hellblade trailer. Have you seen the new Hellblade trailer that they tried to call gameplay? No. No. Hellblade 2, new Hellblade's 2 latest trailer, they tried to call gameplay? No, I'm sorry. About the only gameplay I saw in that was maybe you holding a joystick and walking around. Everything else was cinematic, dude. There's no flipping way. And we've talked a little bit about this too, like something like Fable, right? Was there some gameplay in there? There was some gameplay in there. But there was a lot of it that was also not gameplay. I just know that there was a good amount of it that was also not gameplay. But it's that like blurring of the lines of what they do with these more modern games of you're controlling everything and then all of a sudden you're not. And then you are and then you're not. And so what they show you is like not traditionally cinematic, but it's also not necessarily indicative of what your gameplay experience will be. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, we used to get trailers all the time that would be solely cinematic, and you knew that none of it was gameplay. And you're like, oh, that's just cinematics, dude. That doesn't tell me anything. Now it's a little bit more like hard to tell. And you can tell that some of it is gameplay, but you can't tell if other parts are or aren't. And you can tell that some parts definitely aren't. And it's hard to pick out how much of that is really going to be a telltale sign of what you're going to be getting out of the gameplay itself. That's what's frustrating me about trailers nowadays. And I don't know if that's exactly what they're going to be hitting on here, but I felt like it was important to kind of detail out why I felt like it was good to pick this article out, because I've noticed this happening more and more and more in the industry, where it feels like these developers are going, well, we can still call that gameplay, even though it's really not. And I'm not a fan of that. Video games have a well-established marketing cycle. A key part is releasing a teaser. Process for this can often be quite involved, with some publishers creating a breadcrumb trail of clues and mysteries to solve before eventually giving up the goods. While this is undoubtedly a great way to build anticipation and hype, what happens when the goods aren't that great? On this episode of Spot On, Tam is joined by guest host Jeff Grubb to talk about the frustrations that can arise from teasers, particularly when they provide very few meaningful updates on high-profile games and still far from ready. Also talk about the impact that a lack of satisfying information on games can have on people outside the developer and publishing teams, particularly as big events such as the Game Awards approach. Yeah, Ferret. Yeah, buddy. No worries. So, I'm not gonna, this is obviously their, spot on podcast stuff, vodcast. And But it does bring up something that we've talked about a bit here, and I'll link this for you guys. If you guys want to watch this or whatever, then that's cool. Check it out. I think it's a viable topic to talk about for the industry because it's getting tougher to tell, and a big part of that is because you remember back in the day. You remember think about back in like you know take the evolution of like remember when PlayStation first came out? Take like PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 days. That era, not just that console specifically, but that era of gaming, okay? When you would play a game, it was obvious when you would be playing the game as opposed to watching a cinematic, right? Because the graphics were significantly different. You couldn't play the game in the graphical fidelity that they could do cinematics, right? And nowadays, it's almost indifferent. You can't really tell. It's negligible. Like a lot of times, the gameplay that you're doing is the same graphical fidelity as like the cinematics are, right? So it's hard to tell, and we all know this, right? Developers are going to show you what they want to show you. Nobody should be ignorant to that fact. Developers, through their development process, are always going to show you what they want to show you to hype you up. You should always have that in the back of your mind. How many times have we had banger ass trailers come out for games and then been severely disappointed by the product itself? So you have to, I think, always be a little bit weary of what developers are trying to get you hyped about. They want to show you what they want you to see. They're going to show you what they want you to see. Yeah? But nowadays, as opposed to those days I was talking about in our gaming history, it's so much harder to tell because the games look so good, even in the action sequences that we're controlling everything of. Granted, there's still quite often a difference, but if you look at what games are being developed as now in the current engines and stuff, the modern engines, it is lifelike. And the cinematics are lifelike too. So quite often, it's much harder to tell nowadays the difference between going from a gameplay sequence to a cinematic sequence than it ever was before. So it's easier for a developer to kind of pull the wool over our eyes a little bit, if you will, and go, oh yeah, this is all gameplay, right? Which is why I have a hard time buying it a lot. Especially when we see something like Hellblade 2, the latest Hellblade 2 trailer. They're like, yeah, this is all gameplay. It did not look like gameplay. It looked like cinematics almost entirely. It was like, why? Why did you call this gameplay? This is weird. So I don't know. I think that's something that people need to keep in mind. To all the developers out there, and I'm talking about companies, right? To all the developers and publishers out there that actually, do us a solid and show us significant gameplay in the trailers before the games drop and show us exactly what the game's going to be like, thank you. That's great. We love that, right? But we know that not all developers and publishers are doing that for us. Yeah. So it's hard to pick out quite often because we've been duped so many times by this process. So it's one of those things that I think is important to talk about because the hype machine gets built up and we've been duped by it so many times, It's just important to be careful.